What's up? Today we're gonna analyze a very interesting mismatch battle between the world champ Magnus Carlsen playing white against an average 1600 rated player playing black. It was a simul game played in New York, and Carlsen started with pawn e4. By the way, we're gonna have a very special guest at the end of this video, so stay tuned. Black responded with pawn d6, known as the perk defense, and after pawn d4, knight f6, Carlsen played pawn f3. And of course, we're not going to just cover the moves played of the game, we're going to see the difference between an average player versus a world-class player. And it's actually going to be something like a crash course about positional chess, because in this game, Carlsen demonstrated pretty much all of the elements of positional play that you gotta learn. And more specifically, we're going to cover the top 5 ideas Carlsen used in this game, which made him superior compared to his opponent, and that's the ideas that you can incorporate in your own game just as well. Okay, so right now Carlsen played pawn f3 to protect the other pawn on e4, which was previously attacked by the knight. Even though f3 looks like a deviation from classical opening principles, indeed playing knight to c3 instead would be a better option, but f3 makes some sense. Carlsen doesn't want to block his c pawn so that it can still be pushed forward on the next move, which is what he actually did. Black played pawn c6 here, and let me actually start right here. Even though some may say that c6 is a theoretical move, I don't quite like it. And here's the reason. Your opening moves should follow one of two ideas. It should either develop a piece or influence the center. And if you think about this move c6, it does neither of that. It doesn't develop a piece, quite the opposite. It actually limits the knight in the way where it can be developed. It also does not really influence the center, because if black wants to influence the center directly, they could play some other move which would be more influential, such as, let's say, pawn c5, or maybe pawn e5, or even pawn d5. Anyway, one of those moves would definitely influence the center in the most straightforward fashion. So once again, the first major takeaway, all of your opening moves should either develop a piece or influence the center. That's how c6 is actually already in this position was a mistake for black. Anyway, let's go next. Carlsen played pawn c4. He is building up this beautiful pawn center. Black plays pawn g6, therefore the game transposed into the King's Indian defense actually. Bishop e3, so far it's more or less normal development. Carlsen played knight to e2, black responds knight d7, queen d2. Carlsen shows that he considers castling queenside and possibly expanding there on the kingside with his attack. Of course, it does not necessarily mean that Carlsen is going to do that, but he has this option in mind. And we can see that black got worried about this, and black played pawn a6. Black's intent here is pretty clear. He anticipates, well, I should say she actually, it's Karelian, I think it's a female last name. So she expects white going queenside here, and that's why black prepares pawn b5, which is to attack the white's king. And now that's the first interesting position where I'd like to ask your opinion about it. How would you play here as white? Basically, we have two different ways of playing it, right? So the first approach would be to start attacking on the king side. You can push the h-pawn forward, let's say, play bishop h6, and your king will most likely be castled queenside down the road, and therefore you're gonna try to attack on the king side. That's approach number 1. Okay, and approach number 2 would be to try to block out the black's intent, b5, by playing pawn a4. So which way would you choose? Let's think about this for a second, because I think it's going to be interesting if you can compare your way of thinking with the Carlsen's way of thinking, and you can learn something out of it. Now let's see what Carlsen did in the actual game. He played pawn a4, which is interesting, because most likely, actually, the white's bold attack on the king side was objectively a stronger way. But Carlsen decided to instead prevent black's counterplay on the queen side. What's the point? Well, the reason is Carlsen really loves playing risk-free. He always tries to watch over his opponent's threats and ideas and prevent them. And that's actually the key takeaway number 2. When you follow the same idea and you watch over your opponent's ideas and plans, you try to stop them, then you get into a position where you have no risk to miscalculate something, to blunder something, or to lose a sudden game. For example, if imagine white goes here pawn h4, something like this, and black goes pawn b5. Now we have this double-edged position where white needs to calculate carefully. There is always a risk that you'll miss one of the black's attacking moves there, and you can go down accidentally. Instead, if we take this move back and play pawn a4, now there's nothing white has to worry about, and you can keep building up your position risk-free. Alright, black played pawn c5 here, trying to attack the white center. White plays pawn d5, gaining the space control, space advantage, which also limits black's space for maneuvering his pieces, or I should say her pieces. And at this point, black played knight to b6. Let me also ask your opinion about this. If black wants to move this knight, should it go to e5 or to b6? Because these are the only two options for this knight to move forward. Which one would you choose? In the game, black played knight to b6. The idea in both cases is to attack this pawn over here on c4. But of course, choosing between the two options, normally you gotta move towards the center. That's one of the most classical fundamental rules of chess, and well, it does work. When there is an equal choice, you gotta move towards the center. So knight e5 was definitely a much better option. A knight in the center of the board controls so many squares around. That is definitely a more powerful beast compared to a knight standing on the edge of the board. Therefore, knight e5 was definitely a better option. Knight b6 tries to pursue the same idea, but the knight is misplaced here, and as you can see here, it doesn't have any future. All the forward squares are already controlled by white. Anyway, white plays knight g3 to open up the bishop so that it provides the defense for the pawn. Black goes pawn a6, and at this point Carlsen plays pawn a5, kicking this knight off and trying to attack it. By the way, it's quite an interesting point. That also shows you that Carlsen is actually a human being. He's not perfect, and he's not a god of chess. Because I'm pretty sure that actually Carlsen missed the counter blow that black could play but didn't play in the game. Black could play pawn takes d5, ignoring the threat to the knight, using the fact that if white actually goes ahead and captures it, black has this double attack in the middle of the board, and it looks quite promising for black really, because this pawn will take away one of the white's minor pieces, this pawn on b6 is hanging, and it looks pretty good for black. So I'm pretty sure that Carlsen missed these tactics, because it's a sudden option that black had here, but nevertheless, what's remarkable about Carlsen is that he plays pretty decent chess, even if it's not the best day of his life, or he feels down, or if it's a simul game like this one, so he didn't have time maybe to calculate through everything very accurately. Nevertheless, he plays decent chess, and he never goes down the path where he loses, pieces, blunders something terribly. He's always playing decent chess. And in this case, let's take a move back here. Even though he missed it, still a5 was a decent move. Just instead of taking the knight here, Carlsen would probably recapture over here, maintaining a good position. So even though a5 was probably not the strongest move, missed the black's counter blow, it was still a decent move to play. And by the way, it follows also one of the main guidelines of chess to attack. I also have a separate video where I break down the two most important principles you gotta follow while playing a game of chess, how you pick the right move. If you aren't familiar with that video, then you can watch it later after watching this one. Anyway, in the game, black chosen the most natural move, knight goes back, but it fails due to this exchange on e6. And at this point, black probably realized that she cannot really recapture, because that would lose this pawn here on d6, creating also lots of damage here in the black's position. The white's queen is extremely active and black's pawns are weak. Therefore, black realized that, and instead of recapturing here, black played knight e5. But now after an exchange, white is a pawn up and definitely has a great position. And now we're coming to a very nice position where you have one in a lifetime opportunity to outdo the world champ Magnus Carlsen. He played a move bishop e2 in the game, which is a decent move, there is nothing wrong with it, but it could very well be that Carlsen missed a tactical shot that he had here. Therefore, please think about it and write it down in the comments below if you can find the tactics missed by Carlsen. To be 100% clear, I'm not exactly sure whether he missed it or just decided that it's not the best way to do, but it could very well be that he missed it because it's a rather sudden move. Anyway, he played bishop e2, black responded bishop e6, attacking this pawn over here because it's attacked twice with black's knight and bishop, therefore white needs to protect it, and white played knight d5, solidifying his position in the center and blocking the line of the bishop. Black traded here on d5. Here's another moment where I'd like to ask you to think about this. What do you take here with the c pawn or with the e pawn? What do you think about this? Which move looks better to you? Actually, we already discussed that. One of the ideas of chess is that you gotta move towards the center, right? And the center lines are those two central files, e file as well as d file. Therefore, you want to have more of your pawns and pieces standing on those lines. And with that in mind, c takes d5 is the way to go. Black plays here bishop to d7. Now white castles, finalizing his development. Black played b5, trying to expand on the queen side. White takes en passant. Black recaptures. And that's another interesting position to think about, because it's quite a classical position. Both sides have finished their development, and it's the beginning of the middle game stage. You gotta figure out what to do. That's basically the situation you have in almost every chess game that you play. Now, how would you approach this? There are many different ideas that white can pursue. White can try to expand in the center here by playing something like pawn f4, kicking this knight away. Maybe white can move one of their rooks somewhere, maybe make some prophylactic moves such as king to h1. As you can see, there are possibly lots of ideas that white may consider. And here's another very interesting guideline for you to remember. When unsure what to do, follow the principle of the least active piece. It's one of the most universal rules of chess that it's definitely worthwhile remembering, which states simply that you gotta figure out which piece in your position is the least active and improve its position. And in this position, white realized that his rooks aren't really active, in particular that rook on f1, because it really does nothing here, and therefore Carlsen played rook to a5, preparing to double his rooks along the a file so that the rook from the f1 will get involved into play. Black played bishop c8, quite a passive move, but black just wants to protect this pawn. White continued with his plan rook to a1. Black played rook c7, not sure what's the purpose, perhaps black wasn't sure what to do. And at this point, there is another very Carlsen-like move, because white's position is completely dominating here. White has an extra pawn, a more active position, better control in the center of the board, and many players would think here, okay, let's start the attack, let's push the pawn here forward, f4, and then maybe either e5 or f5 in the future, and let's start attacking black. And that was a nice way to do it. That's a possible way of approaching this position. But Carlsen played another move. He played the move pawn h3. And his idea here is that he doesn't want to give any counterplay to his opponent. If white, let's say, plays that move pawn f4 we discussed, black can go knight g4. Even though, of course, it's not super dangerous, white can always take this knight, and anyway, it's not a major threat anyway, but nevertheless, the position becomes more tactical. Black has some counter ideas. The knight is attacking here, the bishop gets active along this diagonal, and there is again some risk that you may miscalculate something or blunder something. And therefore, instead of that, Carlsen played the move pawn h3 just to eliminate any possible counterplay so that he doesn't have to calculate anything really, and he can just keep improving his position gradually. Very nice approach. He doesn't rush into the attack, but he wants to build up his position as much as he can before he goes into the real attack. That's another key takeaway which allows Carlsen to lose so few games, because he never lets his opponent any counter play, as much as he can. Black played queen b3. Again, there is not that much that black can achieve with this move. Potentially it threatens knight c4. Again, not such a big threat, but Carlsen chosen to prevent this anyway, following the same risk-free approach. Kicking the opponent's piece out of his territory, queen b6, and now pawn f4, where the knight has no other option but to go back to a completely passive position. Right now, this opened up the bishop here, looking towards the pawn, and Carlsen played pawn b3 to protect it. Black played rook to e7, and that's another quite interesting position, because the best move in this position should be pawn e5. White is having such a great advantage here that is definitely time to start attacking. And black can't really recapture here, because then bishop takes c5, double attacks the queen and the rook, therefore that will be winning for white. So going back one move, e5 should normally be the best way to play, and Carlsen knows that, but he doesn't play this move. Isn't that interesting? Yes, it is. Instead of pushing the pawn forward, he plays bishop c4. One more move to solidify his position, bring one more piece into the attack. And as you can see, he follows the same idea of not being hasty with his attack, but improving everything that he can, as much as he can, just to eliminate any possible risk. Black goes here, knight to d8, and finally white pushes that pawn forward, e5 when it's 200% prepared. Black can't recapture here for many reasons. One of them is pawn d6, which is discovered check, as well as attack of the rook. So that would be losing to black immediately. Black would lose the rook. Therefore, instead of that, black played knight b7. Black is going back and forth, but there is not much they can do really, because Carlsen restricted any counterplay so well. Now white can win another pawn on a6 here. After this trade, the queen goes back here to c7. And that's another position where we may think about this for a little while. Now, what would you do here? Just think about this for a second. I'm pretty sure most players would calculate some moves such as pawn takes here, or maybe pawn e6 to have this extremely strong passed pawn. Maybe the rook can get involved and play rook c6, hitting the queen, something like that. There are many tempting options for white to go, but Carlsen doesn't play any of those moves once again. So you can see that there is something special about his approach to chess. He plays the move knight e4, following the principle of the least active piece. We discussed that ago. When not sure what to do, just follow the least active piece, because it's always at least a decent move to play. Even if not the best move, but at least it's a good enough move to play. And he realized that his knight on g3 wasn't doing much, so he's centralizing the knight, and of course from here it gets involved very actively into the game and has a lot of interesting squares to attack. By the way, the principle of the least active piece is one of the most important principles of chess. There are a couple more principles that you gotta know. If you aren't familiar with them, I would recommend that you check my free masterclass by clicking the link below the video, and there I break down several most important principles of chess that you gotta know. Anyway, let's go next with the game. Black played king h8, because otherwise there is this potential x-ray of the bishop, which is ready to attack the king. And now Carlsen took the pawn on d6, knight takes d6. And here Carlsen found the way to win the game. Actually, rook takes d6 does not win the game, because black can also take the white's rook here, the white's knight, I'm sorry, here on e4. Therefore, that would only be an exchange. Instead of that, Carlsen plays another move, rook to c6, which is a forcing move, attacks the queen, and in tactical positions where both sides are attacking each other, you gotta calculate forcing moves, which are checks, captures, and attacking moves. So here rook c6 puts pressure to many of the black's pieces and actually wins the game. Because now after knight takes e4, rook takes c7, black probably thought that they can trade queens and take here on d2, but she didn't calculate it well enough, because after knight takes d2, white has lots of options. They can take the rook or the bishop, which is even stronger, and white just takes too much of the black's material. For example, rook takes c8 would be check to the king, and it's also pretty hard to block this. The knight on d2 is still hanging. It's pretty obvious that white is winning here. That's why black did not do that, but in that case, black has to sacrifice their queen, so rook takes c7. And that's another little fragment for you to think about. Where would you move your queen? Now, it's been attacked by the knight, therefore you must move the queen, but there are plenty of the squares for the queen to go to. And I'm sure a lot of players would play something like queen d3, just putting the queen to a well-protected, solid position. But the best move is queen a5, played by Carlsen, because another rule of chess states that you gotta try to move forward. Because when you move forward, you activate your pieces as much as you can, and they also start hitting your opponent's position and creating troubles for your opponent. Therefore, black played rook d7, now queen e8, pursuing the same idea, attacking black's pieces over there along the last rank, rook d8, and now queen c6, possibly threatening this pawn, or maybe queen can go to c7 and keep attacking. Black played bishop f6, and now bishop d3. Black has a bunch of hanging pieces here in the position, and white is trying to take advantage of that, so it's already quite hard for black to defend all of those hanging pieces. Black tries bishop d7, but now queen to b6. And once again, there is just too much for black to handle, because almost all of their pieces are attacked directly or indirectly. And black made a blunder by playing bishop d4, but I don't think there is anything else they can do to save their position anyway, so bishop d4 was a blunder, white captured the rook, and black resigned. We discussed a lot of ideas in this video. It was really something like a crash course of positional play, because almost all of the main chess ideas of strategic positional play was covered in this game, but let's focus on the 5 most important ones that you may take away from this video. So the first point was, after we rushed through the first couple moves here of the game, where black played here pawn c6. And that was the first mistake, which made black's position more passive and caused troubles later on. So the first takeaway is, in an opening stage, aim for every move that you play to either develop a piece or to influence the central squares of the board. And if your move does neither of that, it's probably a mistake, such as the move pawn c6. Alright, going forward, now let's just go a couple moves forward here in the game, where black decided to expand on the king side. And that was an interesting position, on the queen side. Instead of trying to push his own plan, Carlsen watched over his opponent's intent and decided to stop that by playing pawn a4. And as we can see, he carried on the same pattern throughout the entire game. He always wanted to be safe and to prevent the opponent's counterplay. Instead of trying to deal with it or calculate variations, he chose the simple approach, and it worked extremely well. Alright, the next moment was over here after black played pawn c5, pawn d5, and here instead of moving the knight to the center of the board, black moved it to the side, which is another key takeaway. Whenever you have an equal choice, you gotta move towards the center. So knight b6 was the move in the wrong direction, and after that, here it allowed white to win the pawn, get in a good position here. After that, white still captures towards the center, following the same principle. The next interesting moment, I think, was in this position, where white, instead of trying to do something extremely active right away, he followed the principle of the least active piece several times throughout this game. Instead of trying to be active, he just always improved the position of his pieces, such as in this case, he decided to get his both rooks involved into the game first, before deciding on the actual plan he's going to pursue. And the final interesting moment, I think, was about this position, where instead of again trying to push in the center right away, he played this prophylactic move pawn h3, preventing this very subtle threat knight g4, but he wanted to be risk-free. And so again, the idea is that instead of dealing with an opponent's counterplay, always try to prevent this, and don't rush with your plans, but build up the position until you can transition into the attack smoothly. As promised, here is a special guest of today, my cat. A lot of you guys asked whether it's a real cat or a toy, so he asked me to confirm that he is real, and as you can see, he's not a kitten, he's actually a pretty big, massive dude. By the way, click the links around us for more resources that I mentioned earlier. Stay tuned.